this event to invite me to talk here. I'm very happy to be here this week. And I'm currently a postdoc at UC Berkeley and in Berkeley National Lab. And before I start my talk, I would like to say a few words. Oops, not working here, sorry. I would like to say a few words to Professor Eduardo Miranda. It's Eduardo's birthday this week, and he has a very important role in the career of many of us that are here this week. In my case, I was an undergrad student at University of Campinas. I also did my master's and my PhD there. And during the years that I was there from 2009 to 2019, I had the honor to be taught 3 different courses from Professor Eduardo, classical mechanics in undergrad, and many body physics and electrodynamics in grad school. And I learned a lot with Eduardo, not only in these amazing courses that he gave us, but also by talking to him in the department. And I would like to mention in specific the many body physics course. This was one of my favorite courses of all times. I have here my notebook with the lecture notes of the courses that I bring with me everywhere I go. So this is like a treasure that I keep. And here I show a copy of one of my solutions of one of the exercises in the course, where Eduardo asked us to derive the Feynman diagrams for electrons in a external potential. And a few years later, I was used what I learned here to calculate the effect of disorder in superconductors, and also to calculate interplay between disorder scattering and Magnon scattering in ferromagnetic materials, and more recently, to calculate a nonlinear response of many body systems that is called multidimensional spectroscopy, that we are going to hear in more details during Victor's talk on Wednesday. So thank you very much, Eduardo, for everything that you taught me. You are a role model to me, and I wish you a very happy birthday. So, today what I would like to tell you about is a novel type of transport phenomena. It's a nonlinear Hall effect that is mediated by a geometric property of the electronic wave functions that is called quantometric. And this was a work that was done in collaboration with my former supervisor, Professor Peter Ort from Iowa State University, and also in collaboration with a lot of theory and experimental groups from different institutions through the Center for the Advancement of Topological Semimetals. So here is the outline of the talk. I'm going to start saying some generic features of different types of Hall effects. Then I'm going to introduce this quantity that is called quantometric, and I'm going to show how it appears in transport phenomena. Then I'm going to move to our main results, that is the first observation of this new type of Hall effect in this material that is formed by manganese, bismuth, 2 tellurium 4, and black phosphorus. And at this point, I'm going to take an approach to show you why this is an ideal platform to observe this effect, and what is a minimal model that we can use to express this effect. And then I'm going to just show you the main messages as a summary. So I'm also going to start from the very basics. So the Hall effect was first observed in 1879 by Edwin Hall. So what it is the development of a voltage that is transverse to the direction of a current applied in the material. We need to have, in this case, a magnetic field present in the system. And the Hall effect, this is called normal Hall effect. And it is very important to characterize the type of carriers that we have in the system and also the carrier density of charge in the system. Another way to phrase this effect is saying that we have a current response that is transverse to a driving electric field. And but a couple years after that, Hall also figured out that this phenomena can happen even in the absence of an external magnetic field, as long as the material that we are using is magnetic. And this is known as an anomalous Hall effect. So these two phenomena, they look very similar, but we are going to see that they have very different microscopic mechanisms. What they do have in common is that they require the break of time reversal symmetry. So over the years, a lot of different Hall type effects were discovered, not only in the charge sector, but also involving spin currents and heat current. These effects have a counterpart where the conductivity is quantized. We heard about this in the previous talk. These are the famous quantum Hall effects. And the important point is that the understanding of the microscopic mechanism behind these effects leads to important breakthroughs in our understanding on the behavior of electrons in solids. So the anomalous Hall effect, for example, is one of the first examples that teaches us how the geometric properties of the electronic wave functions play a role in observables, and the quantum Hall effect shows us how the topology of these electrons also play a role in the properties of materials. And the quantum Hall effect is sometimes called as the father of the topological phases of matter. More recently, a novel class of Hall effects were discovered. These are the nonlinear Hall effects, and they are going to be the main topic of this talk today. So what is these nonlinear Hall effects? So as in the linear case, we have a current response in the system that is transverse to the driving electric field. But the difference here is that the current depends on higher powers of this driving field. And because of this, this current response can oscillate at a frequency that is different than the frequency of the driving. And the simplest case is shown here. That is the second order anomalous Hall effect, where the current depends on the square of the driving electric field. And because of that, two things can happen. Either we can have these frequencies omega-1 and omega-2 being the same, and the current is going to oscillate with twice that frequency. This is called second harmonic generation. It's very similar to nonlinear optical responses. Or we can have that these frequencies are opposite, and in this case, we will generate a DC current in the material. This is called rectification. And another thing that is different from the nonlinear Hall effect to the linear one is that in this case, we don't necessarily need the break of time reversal symmetry. But what we do need is to break inversion symmetry. Otherwise, inversion forces this tensor to be identically zero. So the study of the nonlinear Hall effect is important, not only from a technological point of view, because there is a lot of interest in this rectification process here, but also from a fundamental point of view, because understanding the mechanism behind this effect gives us information about the geometry of the electronic wave functions that cannot be captured in the linear Hall effects. So let's see now what is the mechanism behind that. And before we discuss the mechanism behind the nonlinear Hall effect, we have to go back a few steps and talk about the linear Hall effect. So the simplest case that we saw, that is the nonlinear, the normal Hall. We can understand it classically. This is just the drift of the electrons that is caused by the Lorentz force. But for the anomalous linear Hall effect, the situation is a little bit more tricky. We have contributions of two effects. We have an extrinsic contribution that comes from electron scattering by disorder, and this depends on the electron lifetime, but we also have an intrinsic contribution that is independent of the electron lifetime. And in order to understand this intrinsic contribution, we cannot use only band structure theory alone. We need to consider also the properties of the electronic wave functions. So to see how this happens, we can treat the electrons in the system using a semi-classical approach. So we have to solve the equations of motion of the electrons in an external electromagnetic field. And up to linear order in the driving electric field, here I'm switching the magnetic field to 0, we find that the electrons acquire an extra component of the velocity that is called anomalous velocity. The anomalous velocity is transverse to the electric field and also to this quantity here that we already saw in the previous talk, that is the Berry curvature. So the Berry curvature is a property of the electrons moving in the periodic environment of the solids. We can define it in terms of the cell periodic part of the Bloch wave function as shown here. So it's defined in terms of derivatives of this cell periodic function, and we can think of this Berry curvature as an analog of the magnetic field in momentum space. So it's this effective magnetic field that is here causing this deflection of the electrons, and that is originating the whole conductivity in the system. So if we use this anomalous velocity to calculate the current of the electric current, we are going to find a Hall coefficient that depends on the Berry curvature and depends here on the density of the electrons, the Fermi-Dirac distribution. And looking to this formula, we can readily see why time reversal is important. So under time reversal, the Berry curvature changes its sign, but the Fermi-Dirac distribution doesn't, so this integral goes to 0 if we have time reversal in the system. Now, the Berry curvature also plays a very important role in nonlinear Hall effect. This is one of the mechanisms where this phenomena can happen. So in these materials, in this nonlinear effect, as I mentioned before, we need to break inversion symmetry. So, and this is a nonlinear effect, so there are two contributions here. We have the anomalous velocity that is induced, and we also have a correction to the distribution of the density of the electrons. And when we put this all together, and I don't have time to go into details, we end up in this expression for the Hall coefficient, and it depends on this quantity that is called a Berry curvature dipole. So what happens is that if we plot the Berry curvature in the Fermi surface of this material, we are going to find now, instead of something that is uniform, as in the anomalous Hall effect, we are going to find a distribution of Berry curvature. There is a region of the Fermi surface that has positive Berry curvature, and the opposite region that has negative Berry curvature, and this induces a dipole in the system. And this is this dipole that is going to generate this whole current, and the whole current is orthogonal to the direction of this dipole. In order for this to be finite, we need to break inversion symmetry. But we don't need to break time reversal. And this effect was observed in this material very recently. But if you look to this expression again, you're going to see that what appears here is, again, the electron lifetime. So based on the definitions that I gave you before on what is an extrinsic and what is an intrinsic contribution for this effect, this one is extrinsic. And then the question, is there another contribution that is intrinsic to the material? And the answer is yes, but now it depends on another property of the electronic wave functions, that is the quantum metric. So what is this quantum metric? So it happens that a characterization of the geometric features of the electronic wave functions is not complete if we consider only the Berry curvature. We need to consider this more general object. This is called the quantum geometric tensor, and it is also defined in terms of the cell periodic parts of the Bloch wave function and its derivatives, as you can see here. And if we use closure relation in this part here, we can rewrite this expression in terms of this quantity A's that are the non-abelian Berry curvature, because they involve many bands of the system. And turns out that this non-abelian Berry curvature is a complex quantity. So this tensor here is also a complex quantity. If we calculate the imaginary part of this tensor, we find the Berry curvature that we discussed before. But if we calculate the real part, we find something else. We find this tensor G mini that is a symmetric tensor, and this is called quantum metric. This is called quantum metric because it's a measure of a distance, and what the distance it's measuring is the distance between quantum states in the Brillouin zone. And this is something that is sounds very abstract. You can show this formally by calculating this distance between nearby states, making sure that the distance you calculate is gauge invariant. But maybe a more intuitive picture can be provided in the case of two-band systems, where we can map the states of the system in a sphere, in the Bloch sphere. So each point in the surface of the sphere is a physical state of the system, and two states, they are separated by a distance that is a geodesic in the sphere. And the metric associated with this geodesic is the quantum metric. So I forgot to say, this quantity is known for a long time. So there is this pioneer paper in the 80s. But the consequence of this quantity in physical observables only started to be explored recently. There is a series of papers that show that this appears naturally in nonlinear optical responses. It's also a good tool to probe quantum phase transitions. And here I'm going to show you how it appears in transport phenomena. So to see the relevance of the quantum metric in transport phenomena, we need to go back to the semi-classical equation of motion for the electrons. Now, remember that we have a nonlinear effect on the electric field, so we need to carry the perturbation to second order in the fields. This was done exactly in this paper here. And what they find is that there is another contribution for the velocity of the electrons, that is a field correction to the anomalous velocity. And if we look to this expression, we can see that this anomalous velocity is also orthogonal to the driving field. Right? So if we have an external field in the x direction, we're going to find a corrected anomalous velocity that is along y, and that depends on derivatives of this tensor G that is given in terms of the non-abelian Berry connection that we introduced before, and has an energy denominator here. So this is called Berry curvature polarizability. And if we look to this quantity and remember what we just saw on the quantum geometric tensor, we are very tempted to relate this quantity with the real part of this tensor that is just the quantum metric. And it turns out that we can do this. After some algebra, we can show that the Hall coefficient can be expressed in this form. So we have this first term here. Oops. We have this first term here that involves combinations of the quantum metric tensor. This is called quantum metric dipole. Similar to the case of the Berry curvature dipole, we can plot this quantity in momentum in space. We are going to find a spatial distribution with a region in the Fermi surface that is positive, another region that is negative, and this defines the dipole. Another thing that you see is this extra term that is large for me to write it here. And this comes from contributions for intraband transitions and also interband. And in the case of two-band system that is shown here, this term is identically 0. So, but in more complicated materials, we have to check this term and see if the quantum metric is dominating or not over the signal. But then you can ask me, what about the anomalous velocity, right? It is also there. So how can we detangle the effect of the Berry curvature dipole and the quantum metric dipole? Because in principle, both of them contribute to the anomalous Hall effect. But it happens that these quantities are very sensitive to lattice symmetries. And there is a special type of materials that are symmetric under this product of spatial inversion and time reversal, where the Berry curvature vanishes. And in this case, our transport property is going to be dominated by the quantum metric dipole. So that's why this effect was first proposed in PT symmetric materials. And now we're going to see the first observation of it in this material that is this heterostructure of MBT and BP. So this was an experiment that was designed by Professor Suyan Xu in Harvard. They construct this heterostructure here. We have a layer of manganese, bismuth, tellurium in the middle of two black phosphorus layers. And they applied alternating current in this direction. And they measured the longitudinal voltage and also the Hall voltage. And what they find is the following. I keep pressing the wrong button. What they find is the following. We have a Hall voltage that is large, and we have a negligible longitudinal voltage in the system. So this shows that in this system, there is a dominance of the Hall response. And in order to understand why this Hall response comes from the quantum metric, we need to look into more details on the properties of this material. So let's start looking for MBT. So MBT is a layered material. The crystal structure is shown here. So we have a unit cell that is composed by 7 layers of atoms. We have 4 layers of bismuth, 4 layers of tellurium, 2 layers of bismuth, and 1 of manganese. The space group of this material is this R3 bar M, and symmetries of this group that is going to be important for our discussion is a threefold rotation around C and inversion symmetry. And below 25 Kelvin, what happens is that the local moments of the manganese order, they order ferromagnetically in each manganese layer, but antiferromagnetic in consecutive layers. So the ground state is a A-type antiferromagnet. And another thing that is interesting about this material is that 2 of these blocks of setable layers, they are coupled by van der Waals interactions, so we can separate them very easily and use it to build a structure with a tunable number of these layers. For structures with an even number of layers, we have this PT symmetry is still preserved. So inversion is broken because inversion doesn't do anything with the moments but flips the order of the layers. Time reversal is also broken, but the product of them is protected. And here we have the first ingredient that we need for this anomalous Hall effect mediated by Berry curvature, which is we have a 0 Berry curvature in the system by symmetry. So in the experiment, we use 6 of these layers. And it might look like a very complicated system to model because we have a very complicated unit cell, but turns out that the low energy physics of the system is dominated by the pz orbitals of the bismuth and the tellurium atoms. So each of these setable layers we can model by an effective 4-band model. This is already known in the literature, and we follow this reference to model each of the setable layers. So we have a Hamiltonian that is 4 by 4. It has 2 contributions. One term that comes from the normal state contribution. It is derived based on symmetry. So this term, this Hamiltonian, is consistent with all the symmetries of this R3 bar M group. And we have a term that describes the lowering of the symmetries due to the magnetic order in the system. This gamma is the strength of the magnetic order, and this -1 here is just to account the fact that the spin flips from one layer to the other. What we did beyond what is shown in this reference here is that we consider these Hamiltonians up to 3rd power in momentum, which is necessary to capture the threefold Fermi surface observed in this material. We also include a hopping from between next neighbor layers that can also be derived by symmetry constraint. And all of the parameters of these models are fitted to DFT calculations. So this is what we find by diagonalizing that Hamiltonian. This is the band structure. And we can see here, I think I went too fast. We can see here that there is a gap close to the center of the Brillouin zone, and there are also smaller gaps close to it. And we expect from that we have a large quantum metric where the gap is small. So this is the second ingredient that we would like to have a Hall quantum metric mediated Hall effect. So if we set now the chemical potential to the highest valence band and calculate the quantum metric dipole over the Fermi surface, this is what we find. You can clearly see here a dipole structure, but what you cannot see very clearly from this picture is that if I consider any point of this Fermi surface and the C3Z related points to it and sum the contributions to the dipole, I'm going to find a result that is 0. So in other words, if I calculate the integral of the quantum metric dipole over the Fermi surface, I find 0. And this is a consequence of this rotational symmetry that I have in the system, which means that in this structure alone, I cannot have this Hall effect mediated by quantum metric. So we need to break this C3Z while keeping this product of inversion and time reversal. So how do we do this? We do this by introducing these black phosphorus layers. So black phosphorus is a tetragonal system. It has 4 non-equivalent phosphorus atoms per unit cell, as you can see here. And because it's tetragonal, it breaks C3Z symmetry in the system. And we considered two sources of this break of C3D symmetry. One of them is the direct coupling between MBT and BP, which we model by the hopping of electrons from BP to MBT, and also the effect of a strain that naturally is induced in the system because there is a large mismatch between BP lattice and MBT lattice. And the strain we also model using only symmetry considerations. So now we have all the ingredients that we need to calculate the role of quantum metric in the system. This is the band structure that we get, and in colors here you can see the magnitude of one of the components of the quantum metric. You can see that this is large in this region where the gap is very small. And if we do the same thing that we did before, let's set a chemical potential and calculate the quantum metric dipole in the Fermi surface, we find what is shown here. So you can see that this Fermi surface is not C3 symmetric anymore, as expected. And if we now integrate the quantum metric dipole, we are going to find something that is different than 0. It's hard to see from the figure, but if we plot the difference from these two cases as function of this angular dependence, we find something that is finite. So this tells us that the integral is non-zero. And this is the Hall coefficient that we calculate using this formula that I showed you before and using this minimal model. This is calculated as function of the carrier density. So this carrier density is going to control the occupation of these bands. Negative values occupy the valence band, positive values the conduction band. And first thing that you can see is that this effect is 0 in the charge neutrality gap, which is expected because this is a Fermi surface effect. And you can also see that upon electron doping, we have this region where the response is very large. This is related to the fact that we have this accumulation of quantum metric in this region of the band structure. And we can also see a sign change in the signal. And this sign change can only be explained by the coupling between MBT and BP bands. And the way we saw this is that we consider, as I mentioned before, we consider two sources of C3D symmetry breaking. One is the strain, the other is this coupling between the bands. And if you take only strain into account that changes the minimal model for the setupole layers, we find a response that never changes signs. It's only when we turn on the coupling between MBT and BP that these sign changes happen. We also compared the calculations from theory and experiment. We have a very good agreement by tuning the coupling of this by tuning the magnitude of this coupling between MBT and BP. This also suggests that what we see in the experiment actually comes from the quantum metric. But this is not enough to show the importance of quantum metric here. We could have in real life that the bismuth, the black phosphorus, and the MBT are not perfectly aligned. In this case, we could have break of this PT symmetry and a contribution from dipole of quantum metric. So how do we know from what we see in the experiment that we have a signal that is generated by the quantum metric? And here I'm going to show you 4 evidences for this effect that is seen only that is seen from the experiment. First of them is we see by considering the temperature dependence of the Hall conductivity. You see here that the Hall conductivity is only finite below this temperature Tn, which is when the magnetic order develops. So this tells us this is an effect that comes from the spin texture in the system and not from the lattice, because the lattice is inversion symmetric. This forces the Berkeley curvature to go to 0. So here, what happens is something that comes from the spin. So it's an evidence that comes from the quantum metric. The other evidence is that if we compare the nonlinear, the Hall coefficient with the longitudinal coefficient over this temperature range, we see that there is a temperature range here where this coefficient is constant and this one is changing a lot. So this tells us that here there is no dependence between these two coefficients, which means that the effect here is independent of electron lifetime, independent of scattering rate. So this is an intrinsic effect that happens in the system, and this cannot be the case of the Berry curvature dipole, because we saw before Berry curvature dipole depends linearly on the electron lifetime. Another signature is the behavior of the sign of the signal with the type of magnetic order that we have. So if we start with an order like shown here, we have a signal that is positive, and if we prepare our state, our material in the time reversal version of the system, we find a signal that changes sign. And this change of sign is related to the symmetry properties of the quantum metric. If the signal were proveniente from the Berry curvature dipole, we wouldn't see any sign change, like you can see here. And the last evidence comes from crystal symmetries. As I mentioned before, the signal is very dependent on the crystal symmetry that we have in the system. And in particular, we have here a mirror along this x direction that is respected by both crystal lattices, the MBT and the BP. This is broken in the magnetic state, but the product of time reversal in this mirror is protected. This symmetry enforces a Hall coefficient. If the source is the quantum metric, enforces a Hall coefficient that is only finite if we consider the y-x-x component. The x-y-y vanishes, and this is what was observed. And if the mechanism here was the Berry curvature dipole, the behavior would be the opposite. So this signal would be finite, this one would be negligible. So this is yet another evidence that what we see comes from the quantum metric. So I would like to finish with the summary of our results. So we saw that there is a type of nonlinear Hall effect that is dominated by quantum metric. The quantum metric. This is an intrinsic phenomena, and that MBT, this heterostructure formed by black phosphorus and MBT, is a good platform to observe this phenomena. We can capture it by a simple model, although the material is very complicated, and it's fundamental that we have the hybridization between MBT and BP bands. So this is a very recent investigation, field of investigation. There is a lot of interesting questions to ask in the future. So we know, for example, that multiples of the Berry curvature play a role in high-order Hall effects. So the question that appears here is what would be the role of multiples of the quantum metric? This is still an open question, and a very interesting question to ask, in my opinion. So I would like to thank you for the attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. A very nice talk. You didn't mention anything about the frequencies that were used for the measurement. Could you say what they were, and also could you tell us a bit what would happen when omega goes into the optical regime? I mean, you have a small gap. Seems to be a small gap semiconductor, this material, and the question is what happens as you go through the gap and approach, in fact, go into the...
Sure. So the frequency here is different from optical responses. In optical responses, frequencies are very high. Here, the frequencies are very low. And the signal that they measure is frequency independent, mostly.
Oh,
so
this
here
is in hertz, yeah, not terahertz. Okay. But could you tell us, would this effect get larger how does it scale with frequency?
You mean if you go higher frequencies than this one?
Terahertz or tenth of EV or something. Do you know how it scales? Because I can of course measure these quantities optically as well.
Yes. I don't know how the optical frequency would play a role here. But,
well, if omega gets large, now you're in the acoustic regime. If I go into the optical regime, is there scaling, or is it just flat as a function of frequency as I go up in frequency? inside the gap, and then as I approach the gap, is there a resonance or something where there will be very large effects in the optics?
Yeah, so in optics, yes, there is. So in optics, if you approach the gap, you are going to have a resonance there, right? We're going to couple the two bands. But here, for the transport, I don't really know what to expect in this case.
Okay, thanks. I mean, obviously, there should also be if I go into there's two effects, right? There's a 2 omega effect.
Yes.
And there's also an omega equals 0 effect.
There is, yes.
So what you've been showing is the 2 omega effect.
Yes.
And was there an omega equals 0 effect that they
yes,
saw as well?
There is, and it depends on the same Hall coefficient. So it's the same microscopic origin here.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the same.
The magnitudes are similar.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
So I have a question about what you call the quantometric dipole is actually quantometric times velocity,
yes.
right? So first of all, this extra velocity is because you consider a nonlinear response.
Yes.
Is that where it comes from?
Okay. Yeah. So this. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, and then I was thinking, you have this ring shape of the dipole is probably because the quantum metric should be maximum at the gap where it's 0, right? But you multiply by, but there the velocity is 0, no? So if you multiply velocity, probably you will peak at some region that encloses the gap. Is that it?
Yes, yes. So here, let me go back to the figure. I think this one is good. So the velocity appears here. Let me just go back a little bit. The velocity basically appears here because we have to calculate this derivative over g. And so the quantum metric appears here in g. So if you remember the expression for the current, we have derivative of g times Fermi function, basically. And you can reorder these derivatives in a way that is going to appear a velocity in front of the g and a derivative of the Fermi function, which give us a signal that depends only on the Fermi surface. So that's how the velocity appears. You have to reorder these derivatives. And regarding the peak of this quantity, it is peaked where you have a gap. So this already shows up in this two-level system here. But if you go, it also shows in our model. It's a little bit hard to see from this cut, but you see that the dipoles are peaked in these edges here of the Fermi surface. So there we are also closer, like the gap is also smaller.
Thaís, here, hi.
Yeah.
Very nice talk. Is a quick question. Is this a property that I can get from the magnetic point group alone, or do I really need to go over the magnetic space group to get whether this is a finite effect
no,
or not?
you can only use the magnetic point group.
So in principle, if someone is patient enough to go over 160, I don't remember, you can get, given the material, you'll be able to tell immediately whether it's there or not.
There is a paper that do this.
Okay.
And they compare the Berkeley curvature dipole too. So you have a list of the symmetries that enable this response to be the dominant in a given type of material or not.
Okay, you have to move on. So please, let's thank Thaís again.